Okay, good afternoon to everybody. So we're going to get started with session 5 after a wonderful Mexican lunch. Okay, so this is going to be a fun panel. It's not an easy one. I think the issue has been raised for a while. How should we get the private sector engaged in something which is not easy to do? And what I think an important message in this panel is not to leave government on its own. I think government needs help. I think they should be supported. And of course, there's many ways to engage. There's the financing, which has been talked about, but there's also the provider side to support government activities. Now, where did the incentives of private sector engagement come from? Of course, and I'm going to go back to two pieces of the message that Mr. Kim mentioned last night. There's the incentives of the gains of the private sector being involved. Of course, there's participation, there's industry that has a lot to gain, there's other logistics operation that has a gain, but the message was there stands a lot to lose for not being engaged. And he talked about a potential repeat of the 1918 pandemic and what that would cost to GDP, and the estimates went into the trillions. So that is an incentive. Now, the other piece of message that I thought was very interesting was he mentioned the adrenaline was gone. And it is the case, we're just talking how the vaccine that just came out for Ebola has pretty much reduced the rush for Ebola. And one interesting discussion is how do you get the private sector engaged, knowing everything we know about the expensive part of not being prepared, and knowing that this will come again, but yet it is not the first time. It's many times that has happened, and the private sector usually does not react as prompt as has been, and the public sector also has its share. So for this, we have 4 excellent panels. We have Staci Warden from the Milken Institute. We have Trish Storman from BCG, Daniel Hanna from Standard Chartered Bank, and we have David Crush from the IFC. So we're going to start with Staci. And Staci, we know about all the devastating effects on the service industry that the pandemics have, how it's not only about just the health impact, but also the economic consequences of the pandemic. So the first question is, what kind of strategies, what kind of frameworks can the private sector devise to be better prepared to cushion the effect of pandemics, especially when you talk about poor country settings?
Thanks very much. This is not, this is a harder, I think, kind of question to make interesting, because it's not about kind of fancy financing mechanisms. It can devolve sort of easily into a list of what governments should do and what the private sector should do. And so I'm going to, of course, do a little bit of that, but try not to do too much of that. And my disclaimer is that I really don't know. I've learned more about pandemics and public health in the last 48 hours than I knew in my entire previous life. So there may be some times that I say, and this is really, wow, cool, but you've heard it all before, but it's maybe more new to me. But I think, you're right. I was surprised yesterday, in fact, that given the huge impact on productive capacity of an economy, that so little of that was actually discussed yesterday in our conversations. We talked a lot about health systems, but we didn't talk as much as I expected about the direct and indirect costs on the economy, both on the supply side as you lose productive capacity, and of course on the demand side as the consumer response also goes away. And just, you probably all know these answers, but these statistics, but the flu pandemic of 1918 took almost 5% off of world output. SARS in Canada, $2 billion, or 3% of GDP, and Ebola, they're estimating up to $4 billion in the region. And it's very, those are very big numbers, obviously. So the question here is, what should governments do to help give a cushion to the private sector? And Edge kind of stole my, well, he didn't steal it, I guess, but he did kind of steal my sort of initial punchline on this when he observed yesterday that this stuff, the stuff that's actually the most important, arguably, is about development per se. Right, and so these are things that government need. The most important things that governments need to do are arguably the things that they need to do consistently and on a day-to-day basis. So the private sector needs infrastructure. If you're going to have a stay-at-home work program, then you're going to need a communications infrastructure for telecommuting that you can rely on. You're going to need a mature media, and I would argue that most importantly, you're going to need a resilient financial system and capital markets that work. So before I get into kind of some of those details, I'll also just say, but not elaborate, on the fact that the macroeconomic environment and always getting the macroeconomic environment right is going to be a critical component to this. So, as you come into the recovery stage of these events, to make sure that the fiscal stimulus, their capacities for the fiscal stimulus to be dialed back, that you don't have an inflationary response, that the government can, these are the kinds of things that can eviscerate the growing sector. And of course, I would argue that one of the most important things that the government can do is have in place a social safety net generally. So, what can the private sector do, and how can the government help the private sector, and then how can the private sector help the government? And the problem, I think, in particular, in the United States and arguably in a lot of countries, is that the private sector thinks, I think, that this is the kind of thing that a government should take care of. Like, this is the government's responsibility, not necessarily the private sector's responsibility. And so it's very important to kind of change that mindset, I would say, through early engagement of the private sector and through looking of ways to cooperate with them, and then to socialize the importance. And we talked about this earlier from Jennifer about tax systems and paying a tax and paying for the government ability to kind of protect them. And I guess I agree with Edge again that it's not necessarily about what Liberia should do and how Liberia should come up with the money, but what the international actors can do. However, having said that, I will say that there is some low-hanging fruit that the government can do to help the private sector. And Olga's paper, I don't know if she's in the room, but I found Olga's paper that was in our folder to be very good paper, and I recommend it to you if you haven't taken a look at it yet. But she said, the second kind of economic cost, not the direct and indirect cost, but the second kind, which is this contagion avoidance and social distancing, is the bulk of the total impact. And again, I was personally shocked to learn that. But if you look at just MERS, say in Korea, how many people have died in Korea of MERS? Like 6 people? But the economic output that has had just from social distancing has been very significant on that economy. And so it's different, right, than earthquakes, because people aren't as scared. If they go near an earthquake, they're going to catch earthquake. They just kind of go on with their daily lives and try to rebuild immediately. So one of the most important things that governments can do is just to communicate. And I'm not a communications expert, but there's a large literature about the right and the wrong ways to communicate in one of these situations, and in particular to make sure that kind of the stigma is not exacerbated so that people don't panic unnecessarily. Second, I think the importance of the private sector going through business continuity planning exercises and what the government can do to encourage that and to motivate that. And some of the lessons there are to have standardized approaches that the private sector can learn from. There's a lot of low-hanging fruit there, just checklists, right? If every company in the private sector had contact lists and the government could kind of encourage that to happen, then you could go a long way just with those couple of efforts. And then, leveraging existing efforts from other areas. The U.S. has, as we all know, leveraged its efforts on terrorism to start thinking about some of these pandemic The government should also give advice and guidance and make information sources available, because because obviously the private sector looks for the government to do those things. And then they can bring private sector actors together at a more meta level, and in particular at the senior management levels. And I'll talk a little bit about what the UK did for the financial sector in a moment. Focusing on SMEs, I think, is also a very critical part of government engagement. And then, of course, leading by example, right? So that government agencies have their own business continuity plans. Now, when we're talking about a kind of a conference that's about financial incentives, then, obviously there are blunter instruments. So there are statutory and there are regulatory incentives for the private sector to do business continuity planning and take on other resiliency work. For example, in the United States in 2002, the bioterrorism legislation gave U.S. federal funding for protecting the U.S. food supply in exchange for preparedness work. So there are kind of examples of that. And pull mechanisms as well can be useful there. So, designating certain providers as critical to the response and then having a kind of advanced commitments from the government to make sure that they give business. And then, of course, regulation, it's very hard, it can be too much, I think, to sometimes mandate that private sector companies do certain things. But right, the upside of regulation is that it can level the playing field. So a lot of times companies, they want to do something, but they're not willing to, take on the cost disadvantage of doing that. So regulation can kind of make sure that everybody does it. And I think, just stepping back, the government can encourage the private sector to take into account the impact, the pandemic type impact of other things that they do, right? So it's not about building the dam, it's about building the dam and then failing to take care of waterborne disease impact of doing that. I'll just end by saying, I have a couple of more points, but I'll end by saying, the other, side of this is that the private sector can do a lot to help. And Trish will talk about that, so I won't kind of steal her thunder there, but I would say that it's important to, engage the private sector very early in all of these kinds of planning processes. And if I can just kind of end by talking specifically about, I would say, about the financial sector itself, because here I would argue is the single most important thing that a government can do to protect private sector as a whole is to make sure that the financial system is resilient. And the impacts here are huge, right? And they come from a sharp increase in risk aversion on the eve of a panic. Asset prices plummet, credit spreads widen, plummeting asset prices put tremendous strains on bank balance sheets. And so the UK FSA runs an exercise every couple of years on financial sector resilience. And in 2006, they ran one on pandemics. It lasted about 6 weeks long, 70 companies, about 4,000 people. And they looked at everything from vaccines to bereavement to childcare to staff fungibility to repatriation and a lot. And this has been held up as a model of very good sector-wide planning. And they came up with a number of different interesting things: codes of conduct for organizations involved in handling cash, how to do a remote working group, how bringing the insurance sector together at a kind of a sector-wide level. And, they came up with a number of specific, recommendations, and there's a lot of them, but, just things like making sure that the central bank has enough cash on hand and the ability to deliver that cash, swap lines with other countries, et cetera, and thinking about, I'll just end with this, thinking about regulatory forbearance, because when balance sheets and prudential limits are breached in a time like this, how do you think about whether how the regulatory environment can adapt to that kind of a one-off situation? Same goes for privacy laws as well that can be thought of. And so, why don't I stop there for this round?
Staci, there's a follow-up question to this, and it has to do with something you mentioned, is getting the government persuaded to act, getting international organizations to act. And the arguments have to be raised, and there's a lot of data evidence that needs to be supported. So the question is, what can be done? What kind of data, what kind of arguments, what kind of evidence needs to be set forth so that governments and international organizations start taking action more expediently? Yeah,
I think the case has to be made both in terms of the human cost and also in terms of the economic impact cost. And I think it's quite important to document events and document the impacts. And you can use analogous events as well. So the loss output from strikes, for example, could be used as an analogous way of measuring the potential loss in output from a pandemic attack. I think quite compelling are statistics that look at the kind of the current account effects of some of these. And then I think for governments also just to be reminded of the potential for social unrest is a critical data point. You know, there are very few studies that undertake any kind of rigorous cost-benefit analysis, though. I mean, I was surprised. I threw, 2 research assistants on this, and they really didn't come up with very much. They kind of estimate the magnitude of the benefits that come from specific improvements. So I think that's an important area for research. But when you think about it, on the one hand, you think about, okay, how would a corporation make the decision to invest in something like this? Well, they think about it in terms of capital budgeting metrics, net present value, internal rate of return, that kind of thing. But on the other hand, they buy fire insurance, but the risk of fire is much less than the risk of a pandemic, and they don't do a cost-benefit analysis around that. So I think it's because there's a good market for certain kinds of insurance, and there's not a good market for pandemic insurance, and that is as important as anything else for driving this. And I guess I would just end by saying that I think it's also important to be clear that there are a lot of unknown unknowns, as was mentioned yesterday. So just knowing and being honest about the fact that the time and the place and the severity of an outbreak can't really be predicted, I think is an important part of the dialogue for that. Yeah.
Very good. So